we'll figure that out as we go. And yes, I will have some tools for you to write down your questions, and we sort of work through some examples if you find that useful a little bit later in the talk, because it's not a talk about social annotation if you don't get a chance to annotate something. But before we do that, let's do a quick agenda. So why would I do this is sort of the main thing for this talk. I am an educator. I come from sort of that side of the EdTech house, so to speak. So we'll be looking primarily at the learning design aspects of this. Some tool and platform choices. I am not here to pitch a particular tech solution to you, but I do have some information about things that are already available, some of their pros and cons. And then the use cases and challenges, which again, I hope we can do a little bit more collaboratively so you're not just listening to me the whole time. Before we do that though, I'm a little bit allergic to just talking to a room full of people without knowing who they are. So if you'll indulge my sort of my false ed tech dichotomy, how many people here would say you're primarily on the tech side of ed tech? Okay, a few. Primarily on the ed side of ed tech? Okay, and anybody who refused to raise their hand because of my false dichotomy? Cool, like it. Good, so that helps me. Anybody also who has some experience, some practice with social annotation tools in previous settings? Okay, a few people, great, love that. So that I will point out one of my other sort of grounding principles is that I am not the only expert in this room. There are a number of other folks around you, and I hope that you all talk to each other and not just to me. And I did say that I would give you a place to write down your questions. So if you want to take a moment to grab the bit.ly or the QR code and pull up our lovely collaborative space. Okay, let's begin. So first of all, why social annotation? Before we talk about why, actually, we should probably talk about what is social annotation. We should maybe define that term before we get into the why. So the visual that I like to use for this is if you take the social part, so threaded discussions, people being able to respond to each other and read each other's responses in a digital space, layered on top of your typical sort of margin notes. I am, for my sins, an English major, and so this is sort of the world that I come from, is marking up physical texts rather than digital texts. But texts are not the only thing that we can annotate. We'll talk a little bit more about that, but since there are folks in the room who have done some things with social annotation, what other things have you marked up? Video. Mm-hmm. Images, yeah. Audio, love it. I mean, it's also maybe worth defining, we can talk about text as sort of a medium, but also this is, maybe a text in a very authoritative lens, right? Something that has been put out by a publisher in a very specific format. Some of the tools that we'll talk about can also mark up websites, like any layer on top of any website, and do some markup on top of that as well, which is cool. So now we'll talk about the why. And because I'm a nerd, we're going to talk about the theoretical grounding for this. Where does this actually sort of tie into the learning science? So I am a constructivist by and large, so collaborative meaning making is a big part of how I think about this. Again, we heard this morning about the, I am used to thinking of this as sort of the banking model. I heard about it as the sort of the drops in the bucket model, and that I try to stay away from that model where I can and encourage folks to actually engage with and make their own meaning out of the content. So I come to it from that perspective. Social cognitive theory also, folks interact with their environment, they interact with each other. Those things influence in both directions. So when you annotate something and you see someone else annotating, those you sort of influence in both directions and get learning in both directions. Situated cognition, meaning that you are not just sort of reading the thing and then walking away from it and talking about it, but doing your thinking and talking about it in the thing itself, embedded directly in that space, in that text or video. And then finally, cognitive apprenticeship is one that I am sort of a newcomer to. Sorry, mic people. Sort of a newcomer to be honest, and I'm a really big fan. So thinking about apprenticeship models from a very old school lens, but bringing this to the way that we think about knowledge work and making, this, hence the title of this talk, making thinking more visible, more legible to other people, and then more imitatable and more collaborative in that way because it's not just up here. So some research findings. I promise not to read from my slides in detail, so I will just share two brief quotes that I have pulled from a growing body of research on this. There's been sort of an explosion of articles about this in the last 2 to 3 years in particular, perhaps not surprisingly, because of the pandemic and its impacts. But it does go back probably I would say 10 to 15 years before that, using the terminology of social annotation specifically. So, and I will say I did not get permission to quote this, the student's comment in my course evals, so I do not have them on my slide, but I did have a student who said, I was really skeptical about this annotation thing, and then after the first 2 weeks, I was like, oh, this is really cool, and now I want my professors to do it in my other classes too. So one very small anecdotal data point, but a useful one maybe. All right, so then thinking bigger picture, not just theoretically, not just from a research perspective, why is this useful? We talked this morning about the doer effect. I've heard Dr. Wiltrout talked about the doer effect in her talk yesterday. So getting learners to do stuff with course content, whether that's engaging with video rather than just sort of watching it Netflix style, whether that's turning their reading into something more active than just moving your eyes across the lines of text. It helps with visible learning. The number of times, I work with faculty extensively, the number of times I have heard faculty say, I don't even know if they're doing the readings. And if they mark up the readings, they're doing the readings, right? Like that is one really easy way for you to know. So I actually love social annotation very specifically as a replacement for the kinds of like reading quizzes and accountability checks that are not really designed to support learning so much as to just make sure that they have done it, right? It helps with scaffolding. This is where that cognitive apprenticeship model comes in, that this can be a really useful way to model expert thinking in context. Here's how I, as an expert or a comparative expert in architecture, for instance, look at a blueprint, look at a design, and think, oh, okay, this is really interesting here, but how does it interact with this piece over here? And I can not just say that out loud and tell my students, but actually leave a trail of that expert thinking process. Directed attention. This is another sort of challenge with expertise versus a novice status, is that it can be really hard as a novice to know where you're supposed to be looking and what's important on a particular page. Even in a 7 to 10 minute video, there can be a lot of content in there that could all be equally important in theory. So helping to direct your learners to the very specific high impact points, and also using that actually as a way to tell, are your learners paying attention to the right things, right? Are they engaging with the parts of the content that they should be engaging with and finding really meaty? Or are they off over somewhere else thinking about something else that you actually were not thinking about? And is that a good thing, or is that something to redirect? Democratized learning. Those of you who know me, you know I can't talk about this without talking about democratized learning. So making learners contributors, making learners also experts in their own right, or at least budding experts in their field, and giving them an opportunity to bring their own perspectives, their own experiences with the material into that discussion. And then finally, the situated aspect of this, the situated engagement. Again, in fact, maybe we'll do a brief sort of a temperature poll. Give me a thumb direction about discussion boards generally. Okay, yeah, I'm seeing a sort of a median of about here. Yeah, there are reasons for that, right? There are many reasons for that. Discussion boards are meant to do a lot of things, including give people places to engage with the content and engage with each other. And in practice, they often just separate learners from the material and become that sort of accountability check again, right? Did you do the thing? Okay, now you write your 500 words and okay, go home. Or go turn off the computer. So putting that engagement and that discussion directly in the material instead of in a separate space can be really, really useful. And I didn't put this on the slide, but many of the tools that do social annotation also will let you then go and search your annotations, go and find them all in one place, where finding that in your discussion threads doesn't necessarily connect you to the original material that you were talking about. So some cool features there. Okay, so I hear a lot. So how is this different from the notes feature, which is already in OpenEdX? And how is this different from, we talked about discussions. And you probably could already answer this question based on what we just said, but just to make it very visual, because we like that. So notes are situated directly in the material. If you have not used the notes feature in edX, I do recommend it. It's a really useful way to get your own individual commentary and responses to the material. Discussions, of course, are discussions. When they're done well, they encourage that social learning and the diverse perspectives, but we need that overlap between the two, and for me, that's where social annotation fits in. So tools, as I said, I'm not going to sort of pitch a particular tool, but I did do some research on things that are already out there that can integrate with OpenEdX currently. You'll see the asterisk. This is tools that I know are OpenEdX compatible via an LTI and that are built specifically for education. I have left out a host of other things that can be used for annotation, but either are not necessarily built to be social or not necessarily built to be used in a class model. There are lots of different ways that you can do this. So this is by no means a comprehensive list. So we have to, of course, start with the open source ones because we love open source. Hypothesis, I have seen really kind of dominating the research for I think a number of reasons. They are primarily a text-based annotation tool. They are free and open source. Hypothesis is a nonprofit, so they are very excited to help support getting Hypothesis embedded into any and all courses where you want to use it. They also have a great podcast called Liquid Margins that I highly recommend. The Harvard X annotation tool, I will say I would like to know more about, and so if somebody wants to help me experiment with it, I would love that. But I know that it's, in fact, I was hoping that Xavier might be here today, and he's not. But he has, I think, Xavier Antoniak has helped some folks use this in OpenEdX courses as well. And then finally, eComma is, again, another open source, which I believe this one, I have not been able to confirm, but their documentation claims that they can do images as well as text. That, honestly, for me, that's the single sort of biggest missing piece in what I have explored so far is a tool that will really do multimedia, including text, including image markup, including video, and do them all really well. So those are the open source options that I looked at. The e-textbook model, does anybody know Perusal or Perusal? Yeah, okay, see some nods. And this one, I do really like that it integrates directly with e-texts, so you can assign a textbook and students can do their social annotation and their interaction within the whole text, versus if I assign a print textbook or even a non-annotatable e-text, I'm back to, are they doing the reading? How do I know? How do I get them to talk to each other about it? And then finally, Annoto is one that I think is relatively newer on the scene. They are primarily video. In fact, they are video annotation first. They are currently working on being able to do, so they can do page level annotations, but not text in the sense of like, let me highlight this sentence on the page only. And same for images, you can do sort of like a note about the image, but not a note that circles or highlights a piece of the image. But they are working on those components as well, so we'll see. Let's see, some other considerations. Oh, yes, please, question. Good question. So the question, I'll just repeat it for the recording, yeah. So the question was, for the primarily text-based tools, can you use it to annotate problems, like practice problems? Great question. Are you thinking in like a low-stakes practice setting or in a graded practice setting? Yeah. 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 I see. Yes, great question. So my experience with hypothesis is that it is a little bit particular about the format of the thing that you're trying to mark up, that it depends a little bit on sort of how that text is embedded or displayed on the page. And I'll repeat the question sort of in brief was for math instruction in particular, marking up practice problems and students having trouble sort of being able to put comments on the questions themselves. So I don't know is the short answer. I would love to tinker with that and find out. In settings where you're presenting students with a practice opportunity and then, but there's no sort of graded implication, it's not an exam question, for instance, I think there would certainly be workarounds, but they would probably be somewhat clunky, right? Let me give you essentially like an iframe PDF of these problems that's no longer the interactive exercise piece. The other thing I will say, and I should have led with this up front, is that all of the interactions that I have had so far with both the folks at Hypothesis and at Annoto, they want to hear about what are the use cases that you would like to use this for that you're not currently able to. So I would say if you find a tool that you're like, I love this, I want to use it, here's what I can't currently do, like talk to those folks because they want to know. Yeah, great question. Okay, let's talk about other, we actually sort of addressed this at the top of the discussion, but so thinking about what are my learners going to annotate in order to decide what tool makes sense. So as we said, text is kind of the classic choice, but images, video, web pages are all also kind of up for grabs. And again, I keep hoping that sort of these tools are going to join forces and keep developing their capabilities to do more of that in more sophisticated ways. Also, thinking about what other features you need. I didn't ask, but maybe I'll get a sense in just a moment about the sort of the context in which folks in this room are using edX. So do you need, for instance, tagging, like concept hashtags, at mentions of other users, grading capabilities, bookmarking off of your site? That last one is one that I really like about Hypothesis when you're using it, not even necessarily within an LMS, but as an overlay on web pages, is that you can actually have students annotate something that's not currently part of the curriculum, and it gets added to the sort of course library. Yeah, it's very cool, right? So yes, this is actually Hypothesis is a tool that I use for sort of collaborative researching and sharing resources with other people and then having those discussions in the text. A little bit outside the scope of maybe most of the use cases with edX if we're talking about sort of MOOCs or structured courses, but useful to know that that does exist and that there are tools that will do that. Okay, so use cases and challenges. This is where I actually want to be very intentional about having this become a little bit more of a discussion, and so I'm gonna make you earn your keep. I'm sorry, by running the microphone around. But so I'm actually going to pull up on the screen. Let's see. Okay, so we have a few excellent questions already. I also put in, if you already tabbed through the options or the pages, a couple of common use cases. Maybe before we talk about these, can I hear from the room, how many folks are sort of more on the MOOC side, the like thousands and thousands of users? I see a couple, okay, many but not all, okay. Let's see, what about folks more on the sort of the small private course, graded activities, more controlled number of users? Okay, a few folks in that boat. What about anybody using edX for more like community of practice, sort of like professional development, not necessarily like a formal education context? Anybody? A few folks. Okay, great. So I had thrown these in as some potential use cases with some sort of starting point questions. I would love for you all, if you're in, are you all in the Jamboard? Excellent, good. Pick a use case that's interesting to you. If you want to really get teachery about it, pick one that you think is hard rather than one that you think is easy, and throw some Post-it notes on there. We'll also take a few minutes at the end. Let's see. A few minutes at the end to talk about some of the challenges that come up with social annotation, like if you're talking about a MOOC where you have maybe 40,000 enrolled users, how does that work with people annotating? Things like grading and annotations, how do we approach that? And then finally, facilitating small group collaboration. There are some sort of techniques around how to do this well, which we'll talk about. But so for now, what I'd like to do is take maybe 5, 4, 3, how many minutes? We'll start with 3 and see how we do, with some of the use cases, and just give folks a chance to throw in your questions, your ideas, and then talk about them as a group. Cool. I don't have music to play for you, I'm sorry. Adam is going to sing us a song, though, I think. Yes, I will recap the assignment because I did not write it down for you. So pick one of the 3 use cases. So the MOOC use case, do we say Spock? I've seen this written and never actually heard it said. Cool. The Spock use case or the more professional community of practice use case. And throw some notes or some ideas or some questions in there.
About how social annotation might be.
Yes. How you might want to implement it, what questions you would have. Yeah, Robin.
What if the things that I'd be concerned about if they're kind of universal to all?
Great question. Then I would throw those on the first slide, which is the just questions in general. Cool. Yeah, okay, so I love these. I'm going to, and actually I see someone helpfully grouping some related comments, which I also greatly appreciate. So maybe some comments / questions, and this is where I'm going to get Adam to run the microphone around so we can hear everybody's voices in the recording as well. So some great comments and questions about sort of moderating challenges in a space with potentially thousands of users. First of all, just how many annotations is too many. I do think that there's sort of an upper limit. The research supports this as well. And for those of you who are in this kind of MOOC model, do you typically break up your learners into cohorts for discussion boards or just have everybody in one discussion space? I'm seeing some just one discussion space. Okay. So there is, I had to do some investigating of this before this talk. The cohorts feature in Open edX, I think, is a really useful tool here. It's a little bit challenging to anticipate what is the right number of annotators per cohort, so there's probably some trial and error involved in that. But when I've used this in smaller courses as well, I found for some things, you know, there was only so much value in getting 25 undergraduates to all mark up the same sort of poem in one space, right? So getting them into smaller groups of, say, 5, so that they could do annotations more meaningfully and then look at each other's annotations was valuable there. Some comments also about social norms and monitoring for bad behavior, which, yes. So I'm curious, again, anybody who has done some work with annotation tools already, or if you've run into and figured out some ways to manage this with discussion forums, comments, thoughts, suggestions on that? Robin? Yeah.
It kind of depends on the size of the course, but setting expectations up front with behavior and even the instructor modeling the kind of responses and thinking and how things should be treated is really helpful. But if it's a larger course and the partner can accommodate it, having someone assigned to be a discussion moderator could really help. But not everybody has those kind of resources.
Yes. Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense to me. I will say one approach that I have used that might also get at some of the questions, a question I saw about, do we have to train users on how to use the tool? So yes, I think would be my general statement about that. So I've had some success in a practice assignment of, we're all going to annotate the syllabus. And in the syllabus, there's some language about sort of community expectations and norms, and then there's a prompt from me of, what would you add to this? Add your annotations with your own contributions to our community norm setting, which was not foolproof, but it did help. Yeah.
That reminded me of something that I've done before edX at a smaller university with instructors asking their students to co-construct a code of conduct. So all the rules or guidelines or expectations were created by the students themselves and agreed upon by them.
Yes, I love that. And yes, always a fan of getting people to co-create the experience that they want rather than telling them what experience you expect them to have. And absolutely applies here as well. Did you also have a hand up? Yeah.
Yes. I asked this question because I'm thinking a lot about it, so I hope other people have more answers. The one thing I've seen maybe work is like not allowing people to be anonymous, like having people's names attached to what they're saying. I think kind of adds a little accountability to it, let alone that then we can track a little. But I think having real names is something I've seen work.
Yes, absolutely. And that is in the tools that I'm the most familiar with, so Hypothesis and Annoto, you can enable anonymous comments like at the course level, but by default it is expected that like your actual name is attached to your comments. And what I've seen in I think Annoto specifically is that even with anonymous comments, the instructor still knows who asked the question. It's just anonymous to other users, so you can ask a question that maybe you feel unsafe asking in front of everybody, but there's still that level of accountability. Yeah.
Yeah, just to follow up on that, some previous research that I did was around social annotation like this in video settings, and we found that learners didn't really feel motivated to contribute if their name was associated because of like they're not comfortable in that safe environment. So like having it anonymous but being able to see it from the instructor's perspective encouraged contribution.
Yeah.
In a sense. Yeah.
That's fascinating. I have more questions.
Good, we love questions. Let's see, some of the other pieces. So I saw the question about how do you motivate learners to annotate, particularly in this MOOC environment of lots and lots of users. Many of those either have always intended to be or end up being more in a sort of lurking role rather than a direct engagement role. So I think for me, that's actually one of the values of being able to do social annotation is that there is still potentially that value to lurk and see how other people are engaging. But I think that is still an open question of is it, maybe let me phrase that in a different way. Thinking about the context in which you might implement this, how important is it to just enable the use of a social annotation tool versus to prompt and scaffold particular uses of that tool? And I think that question is probably going to be answered differently across different contexts.
Yeah, just one other option to throw in there is you can potentially seed the discussion area with some like initial posts by the instructor to like spur the conversation.
Yep. Yes, and again, when I've done this in a smaller setting than a MOOC, I have made it, sort of instead of reading quizzes, you have a reading assignment to annotate a certain number of times and respond to a certain number of questions. There's also some really interesting research about coaching students up front about I think there were 4 levels of annotation. So there was the sort of like clarifying, just like what is this? And then, and I don't remember off the top of my head what the sequence was, but sort of going from just clarifying to understand to sort of interpreting to like remixing and adding on to content. And so coaching learners up front about these are the ways that we hope that you will engage, and these are the sort of higher level, like Bloom's higher level ways that you can engage with this content, and that's hopefully what we will see more of. Statistically, folks tended to, in the research that I saw, tended to populate around the maybe like a median of like 2.1 out of 4, so sort of towards that lower end, but you do start to see some higher end engagement as well. Cool.
Is there any indication by...
Hang on, yeah, thank you.
Is there any indication by how many times the students are exposed to this and asked to repeat these kinds of activities, how engagement changes over time?
Great question. I don't, in my sort of tip of the tongue Rolodex, have an article to cite, so I will tell you my anecdotal experience with that, which is that found it very helpful to one, to have students get more practice over time, but then 2, to level up the expectations of what they were doing in those annotations over time. So and I'm getting, tell me more about that, yes. So thinking about the sort of the cumulative learning sequence and the ultimate goals of the course, we're going to start you out here, and we're going to just ask questions of the text and think about what do you think the author meant by this. And then as we move through the term, maybe we're going to start saying, okay, what connections would you make between this text and other things that we read, right? Or how would you contest this claim that this author is making? So you start asking them to do more sophisticated cognitive tasks, even though the medium, the annotation, is still the same. Yeah.
So do the tools support the connection with outside content and content across experiences?
Great question. Yes. So the across experiences within the sort of course universe, yes, definitely. That's where I would say the tagging is particularly useful. And that's actually a technique that I would like to explore more myself, and I'd love to see other people explore, is sort of preceding, to Adam's point. These are some of the initial tags as a class that we're going to use. And then maybe the class can contribute others. If like, oh, we noticed this theme coming up, and so now that becomes a tag that they can click on and find all of the annotations across the course materials that reference that concept. So within the course universe, yes. I did mention I have used Hypothesis for not just within sort of an LMS, but also as a larger tool of engaging with any kind of online content. And Hypothesis will do the same tagging feature across any of your spaces where you're tagging things. You can in Hypothesis create a private group. So you can use it outside of an LMS, but still with a learning environment, and just invite your students into that group. Yeah. Microphone's coming.
So this is more about your experience with Hypothesis in this other setting, because this is very interesting to me. So I take it works. Does it work for both web content as well as, say, a PDF that is hosted?
Mm-hmm.
That's great.
Yeah, it is great. I agree. Yeah, Robin had a question too.
This is maybe like a silly in the weeds question, but I'm wondering how portable the annotations are. Can someone export them and maybe import them into another course, or create like an e-portfolio kind of thing?
Great question. I saw some light bulbs go off of, oh, that would be really cool. Yes. So yes-ish. And I would say this is another feature that I would love to see these companies curating more intentionally. Currently a limitation with the tools that I've seen, at least with Hypothesis, is that when you start a new term, let's say you start fresh with the same material but with no annotations. So if you want to precede instructor comments or prompts, you have to go back in and do those manually, which is a bit of a pain, or a big pain, depending on how many of them you were hoping to have in there. On Annoto, they do have the ability to keep your preceded instructor comments and just wipe student comments, which is very handy. And I hope that at some point Hypothesis says, hey, we want that, because that would be great. As far as, so I've seen platforms that will certainly will let instructors, and I think also individual users, download like a CSV file basically of all of their annotations. I think it takes them out of the context of the thing that they were annotated on, which is less great. Yeah, I would love to see that become more portable, especially outside of an LMS setting. Yeah. Okay. I want to take another look at, oh, my computer's gone to sleep. Friend, come on. Okay. I want to take another look at, maybe, there we go. Actually, let me just ask, before we move on from the MOOC use case, were there any comments or questions that came up on this one that we didn't get to and that we feel particularly motivated to talk more about? Okay. Let's then take a quick look at the smaller, the sort of SPOC or small private online course. And I see a couple of things that we've sort of started to talk about. So one of them, having the instructor start the annotating to set a good example. Yes, I love this approach. I love this question. And again, the cognitive apprenticeship approach absolutely does validate that model first, show where you're hoping to get them, or even show just a little above their current level, right? So looking for that, the ZPD, the zone of proximal development, the next level of achievement that they can reasonably get to, or even a combination of those. Here's that next step, and here's what expert work looks like, and let's talk about how we get from here to there. I preceded this discussion actually with this comment about assigned learner roles because there's some good research to support that, as with a lot of forms of group work, if you want learners in small groups to meaningfully collaborate on something, giving them specific tasks to do that they have committed to uphold for the group can be a really effective way to structure that and to create some accountability as well. Let's see, and then there was this lovely comment about getting the faculty meaningfully involved, which I want to come look at more closely. Okay, so yeah, please, thank you.
If you give the faculty an option of a new tool, they might be excited to say, oh, that's great, I want my students more engaged and involved and stuff, but it's unclear how to ask them, what are your expectations now that you have this tool for maintaining it, encouraging it, if students are asking questions, that kind of thing? Are you responsible for, watching them and responding in a timely way?
Yes, yeah, I love that question. And yeah, I do think that that becomes relevant to one of the sort of challenges that I had framed as well, which was about grading, and to what extent are your annotations kind of an expected part of students' participation in the course? To what extent is this tool baked into the learning design of the experience versus like, this tool exists, but like, try it, see what you think, right? So I would say, I mean, I'm always sort of on the side of like, try something intentionally and see how it goes and see if it works out in the way that you're hoping, but also giving, maybe depending on the context, do you have individual faculty teaching the same material, but like, so multiple sections of the same course, or do they have a lot of design freedom over what they're teaching and how they're teaching it?
It's a bunch of faculty.
Thank you, sorry.
It's a bunch of faculty building on an M.Ed program, actually, and they're thinking of using Perusal, but they don't have rules yet for how they're going to monitor or even set requirements for this kind of thing.
Yep. I mean, I hate my pat answer is like, ask them, which is not super helpful. But yeah, I would invite those faculty to think about, here's what this tool can do, here's what the research says it supports. How do you see yourself using this in your own teaching approach and knowing your content? Yeah, yeah, cool. Okay, I want to be mindful of everybody's time. So I'm not going to like delete this Jamboard, so if folks want to come back and do some asynchronous annotation and comments in this space, I absolutely invite that as well. Let's see. I want to make sure that we don't miss the chance to talk about our communities of practice as well. So I love this one actually. So the discussion forums are usually specific to individual courses rather than to a subject area or a skill. And yes, that is absolutely sort of part of the architecture of how we think about what is a course, right? Is that like, this is a discrete chunk of knowledge, and all of the learning that happens about that knowledge happens within that discrete chunk. So if that is the architecture that you're working with, do you have, I don't know if I'm speaking to a specific person with this use case, but so my question would be whether learners have the ability to sort of move between courses, or if they are kind of just in the one that they've registered for. I mean, I think we could make an argument for having courses that are focused on a particular area of expertise rather than just like, this is the topic and the 3 units that we're creating. I would also add, thinking again about that ability to tag and to tag content outside of a specific LMS use case. So I believe Hypothesis it treats every course as a private group, partly for student privacy reasons. So there's not, to my knowledge, currently an ability to sort of cross-post with other courses. But you could create a private group in Hypothesis that is, let's see, how would I do this? that is like all of our learners are enrolled in this private group, and the annotations apply to the different courses that, as long as they have access to that course, they can go and look at those annotations. And tagging could also help with then sort of pulling themes across multiple sources. So there would be some interesting ways to play with that, but you're right that whoever posted that comment, the sort of assumption of a self-contained course is a little bit tricky with this model, but maybe in ways that are worth exploring a little bit more. Okay, I'm told I have 1 minute left. Do we have a burning question or comment that we want to add at the very end? Yes, please.
Is there a way you can imagine this conversation continuing beyond this room?
I will pay you later for that question. I would love for this conversation to continue beyond this room. One of my hoped for sort of next project is to actually do some real road testing of like, let's get in an Open edX studio space and put in all the plugins and see how they interact and see what tools seem like they work better. I mentioned the developers of these tools tend to be very hungry for feedback because they want to make a tool that you want to use. So continuing those conversations. I would personally love it, if I were just making a list, to see Open edX make the notes feature also potentially social and have that sort of natively on the platform. That would be pretty cool. So yeah, and also just like send me an email. I didn't put my email on the slide, which was probably a mistake, but I'll write it on the board. Oh, and I'm supposed to stop now. I'm going to write it on the board and then I will stop. But thank you all so much for being part of this conversation.